The 200 miles per hour laboratory is a documentary that explains the unforeseen consequences of irrational behavior. America's 911 emergency system was created out of racing injuries and deaths. Producer, director of the 200 miles per hour laboratory, Douglas Mazel, discusses why humans risk their lives driving at 200 miles per hour with psychologist Dr. Janine Schroth.
Introduce yourself.
So my name is Janine Schroth, and I'm a clinical psychologist. I've been in practice for about 30 some odd years. So
Do they really not think about the consequences?
they probably don't. But there's a lot of different reasons why that might be the case. So there's no one reason, and there's probably no one kind of driver. There's probably different kinds of drivers that are motivated for different reasons, I would imagine. But clearly, not everybody could do that. So clearly there's something about them that's unique and different than the rest of the population, right? And so the way you can sort of think about it is that everybody, in terms of why they do what they do, is motivated for different reasons. And it's usually a combination of, a bit of biology, which is sort of like what you're referring to as your brain, your biochemistry, how you're born, mixed with your psychology, and also then the circumstances in which and the experiences that you have in the environment. So it's a combination of the three. It's always going to be a combination of the three. And they interact to create whatever they create, right? So you could think about, when you think about race car drivers, one of the things I think about would be, it's risk-taking, right? So you're talking about exploratory or risk-taking behavior, and what would make someone do that. So one of the biological factors might be, they're biologically, their serotonin receptor uptake could be such that it takes more stimulation for them to get the same amount of pleasure as someone else. So there's that aspect. We all have pleasure seeking as one of our systems. We have three systems. We have our threat system, which keeps us safe. We have our pleasure seeking, which is what we're talking about now. And then we have our attachment system, our connection system. So with race car drivers, more than likely, they require, they're born with a certain amount of, like if you need more stimulation in order to get the same amount of pleasure, that's going to drive you a little bit to do things that are riskier to stimulate.
So just being alive isn't enough.
That's not enough. So, and we all...
Could you say that? I can't use my voice. So.
Oh, okay. Being alive isn't enough for them. So their tolerance for what would be boring to them is not boring to everyone else. So that's one aspect of it. But then it's also, your environment, it's what you're exposed to. I like to think about what would these people do if they were raised in an environment where they weren't rewarded for that kind of behavior. It's interesting to think about, right? So if they're not rewarded, like our culture, from way back when, right? We needed certain people in the tribe to go spear the woolly mammoth. So we needed to go out there and explore. We needed to do dangerous things in order to keep the tribe alive. And those tribes that probably engaged in higher risk behavior survived. The other ones didn't. So there's that aspect of, sort of those genes that, maybe it had to do with serotonin, those survived and they came into modern day. Well, we're not needing to spear woolly mammoths anymore. So, you know, what do you do if you happen to have that biology, right? So but our culture continues to sort of admire it and reward it, you know, in all the high risk, like whether it's athletics or, you know, well, race car driving is an athletics, it's a sport. In all the things that are daring, we all are sort of fascinated with it and we admire it. Sometimes we pay a lot of money for it. So you get a lot of kudos for it. And so that's highly motivating enough to where a person might risk their life to do it. I don't know if you ever saw, I can't remember the name of the guy he would scale mountains without free climb.
Right.
He wouldn't have it.
I did see that.
Like, why? Like, he could have done the same mountain safely, but he wanted to do it, you know, free climbing.
Right.
So there's an aspect of reward there that if it wasn't there, what would someone do? Would they still do it? If they weren't going to get rewarded, if they weren't going to win a prize, you know, if they weren't going to get in the papers and, you know, get all that sort of social capital. Because our sense of connection and belonging also motivates us to do things to get that, right? That's highly motivating, to want to belong and to be admired and all those things. And that's what it gets you. And so how badly do you want that? How important is that to where you're going to risk your life to get it? And for a lot of people, they're going to do whatever it takes because they want it that bad. Now, why do you want it that bad? Well, that's a whole, you know, then you have to dive into the psychological, really, and, you know, try to figure out why someone would feel like that's, you know, they would risk being alive to get that kind of reward. So
the motorcycle racer, the first guy, he talks about, it's not in the teaser, but he talks about he would watch people die. Didn't care.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he made a mistake. Maybe I won't make that mistake.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, you can tell yourself all kinds of stories, you know, to push it out, right? But, you know, the other thing is, you know, your prefrontal cortex, that's another aspect of it. Your prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain that is responsible for sort of anti-risk taking behavior. So your prefrontal cortex is sort of the seat of reasoning, problem solving, decision making, judgment, you know, all those things that keep you safe, right? And interestingly, when you're under threat, so you feel you know, overstimulated, or you feel like something is threatening to you. Like I see it a lot when you know, working with couples, you know, and they get triggered, and so just getting triggered is a feeling of being threatened. And what happens is, you know, when you get triggered, you know, your fight or flight kicks into gear, right? And when you're in fight or flight, your prefrontal cortex shuts down. And so over time, if you are in a state of fight or flight quite a lot, your brain changes. It's actually different than everyone else's brain. So that's another way that, you know, the brains can be different. Is if you grew up in an environment where there was a lot, you know, lack of safety and felt threatened or not safe, emotionally or physically, as a child, your brain's going to be different. Your amygdala is going to be sort of in overdrive, always, you know, scanning and seeing if you're safe. And so then you have like this elevated level of anxiety all the time. And when you have that, when you're in that sort of elevated arousal level, your prefrontal cortex is going to shut down, because fight or flight is the opposite. So our prefrontal cortex is, you know, again, has all those attributes, but when we are in fight or flight, when we feel threatened, think about it. If you're running away from the bear, You don't sit there and reason and think through it and wonder how fast the bear is running and can I outrun it. Your brain your prefrontal cortex shuts down and you mobilize. And so if you have that in you, and you're basically walking around with an elevated arousal level all the time, your amygdala actually gets larger, prefrontal cortex shrinks, your executive functioning. Of course, there's other reasons people's executive functioning might not be, might be a bit disabled as well. But so if you think about it, if that part of your brain is not online, you can't, your judgment is impaired. Your problem solving is impaired. And so it stands to reason that you would not be making the best decisions. And so that's another possibility, I would imagine.
So if you could repeat this in your psychologist work, that if you started driving go-karts as a kid,
yeah,
your what do you call it?
Prefrontal cortex
would shut down a little bit, or
no.
Because obviously you're not going as fast, and go-karts aren't as dangerous.
Yeah.
My point, I'm looking for, as you keep going, and you said your brain kind of changes a little bit. So
the amygdala gets larger.
It morphs. So
yeah.
And then by the time you're racing at 240 miles an hour, you have a different kind of brain. You prepared your brain for that?
I would say that's a whole different aspect where oftentimes we see people do things like a gymnast, for instance, and you see them do these things that just seem unbelievable. Like, how can they do that, and how do they not feel scared about that? But the thing is they also have a sense of confidence. Oftentimes, they're very methodical, and they slowly develop this skill over time to where it doesn't feel, they have a confidence about their technique, about the technology, what they're using. And so for them, they don't feel scared because they feel confident. So that's a whole different set of circumstances that might be into play. So that's why environment is part of this equation. And like, if you're exposed to go-karts as a kid and it's fun and you enjoyed it, it clicked off your pleasure center, and then you just keep doing it a little bit more and a little bit more, and you're exposed to the technology, you understand, how it all works, and you feel, like you understand it. I think that there's some race car drivers that are very methodical, right? They go through, make sure their car, everything's working, so for them, they feel like they are sort of in control in a way. They feel like they've taken care of all the things that, the technicalities of why this is going to work. And that's what they tell themselves. Now that I've taken care of all those things, I'm going to be safe. Of course, it's, with today's technology, as you point out, you might be safe, because they've come a long way. But not necessarily, right? You're still taking a risk, but they feel like it's a calculated risk that they understand. So there's that, to where it's just a thing that grows over time, and they feel, like they have it handled. So they really don't feel they're under threat at all, or even taking a risk for that matter.
Is it, you start doing drugs when you're a teenager, you're smoking pot or whatever, and then you move up to meth and blah blah, and you eventually end up with heroin because you're looking for that higher high.
Pleasure seeking.
You get, what's the term? Well, this drug isn't enough, so now you have to move up. Desensitized. Is that a possibility that a race car driver?
Sure.
So could you repeat what I said?
Yeah. So absolutely. No, absolutely. That's kind of what I'm trying to describe, is that there might be an aspect where they just keep graduating in intensity of what they're doing, and they do it so slowly that it doesn't feel, doesn't feel like they went from a go-kart to 250 miles an hour. They gradually got there, and there's, there can be a feeling of almost invincibility if you go for a long period of time and nothing bad has ever happened. It's just been fun, and there must be, I'm sure, I don't know, but I'm sure there's an aspect to the actual act that's also pleasure seeking, like just going that fast must, for some people, be pleasurable. I mean, I've heard people say that who get on a motorcycle and go, really fast, and there's a feeling of freedom, whatever it might be, but they're feeling pleasure as they're doing it. It's something that they enjoy. So like anything you enjoy and causes you pleasure, you're going to do it more and more and more, but in calculated kinds of ways.
Okay, so it's pleasure seeking. Might have something to do with, what was the biology?
Mm-hmm.
And then, what is it, nurture nature? Or,
Yeah, the environment, like your experiences.
And there was one more, that you had 3.
Psychological.
And you're born with that. That's part of your structure, your brain structure when you're.
Well, the biology is I think you're born with maybe this serotonin receptor uptake. So you're either a highly sensitive person or not, right? So.
Sensitive to?
Like your senses. Like some people are just born and their senses are more acute. Like you might think about on an extreme, that would be, like someone with autism who can't go outside because it's too loud or, too bright or whatever. Their senses are just more attuned. They're receiving more information, and it's, all of us, if you get to a point, it's overstimulation, right? So for those people who have more sensitivity, that's part of their biology, they're going to have a different experience than someone who doesn't have that. And so someone who has less of that, they're going to be more stimulation seeking, right? Because they're not getting as much. And so they're not receiving as much input as that person who's receiving more. And so that's something you're born with, and that can shape what you start doing as a kid, and then that interacts with what do people think about what I'm doing. Am I getting a lot of admiration and praise for it? Well, great. Then if I do that, I'm going to want to do it more, right? So what would happen if you didn't get any praise for it? Would you still do it? I don't know. Would you? I mean, I think that's a big part of it. I think it's a big piece of it.
Would these guys go around the track if the stands were empty?
Maybe. For some they might. Because they just need that stimulation, right?
Well, a heroin addict doesn't need a crowd, does he?
No. So there's a whole aspect too of stimulation seeking can also be a way to alleviate feelings of anxiety that one has all the time. So you'll see it in a lesser degree, but I mean, a lot of people, that's why they're taking drugs, is because it's a way to distract oneself from what I'm feeling. Like if I don't like what I'm feeling, I'm going to distract myself with something else. So there's that. I mean, I'm not saying that's why they do it, but there may be a percentage that are motivated to behave or do certain things because it distracts you from how you're feeling. Because when you're calm and just sitting and not doing anything, typically all those feelings are going to arise in you. And if they're uncomfortable feelings and you don't like them, you're going to try to find a way to distract yourself with something else. So that's a possible. So that's a possible, like a psychological reason why you might be doing it. So it's like why I said there's no one reason, it's always a combination of all 3 of the experiences that we've had in our lives. It's our biology mixing with the experiences, and how that lands on us is going to affect our behavior, right?
Right. This is great. So overall, though, it serves a purpose to society, right?
Well, it's certainly we need explorers, people who go get in a capsule and fly to the moon. I mean, you need people who are willing to risk their life for a greater cause. You need soldiers, right? Who are going to go to war with the possibility of dying. And for them, they do it for different reasons. It's the same thing, really. I mean, they're putting their lives on the line, but not necessarily. I mean, there's an aspect of the social reward because they believe that they're protecting their country and they're protecting their loved ones, and that's a strong motivation in us. And there's a strong reward to that, right?
Right.
So that would be the same thing, really. And yeah, so we need those people. Our society has always needed the people who will go to those kinds of lengths. And so that's why I think that biology, is part of the tribe, right? You need them. And sometimes their behavior is going to be, highly desirable and functional and pro-social, and sometimes it might not be. So, or even for themselves, it might be detrimental to their own well-being sometimes.
All right, here's a philosophy question. Humanity as a whole, is this gene, this whatever you call it, obviously you wouldn't know, I just want your opinion, part of the structure of humanity, or is it from a mutation?
Well,
and then repeat the question. So
yeah, is the behavior, did it come into being due to a genetic mutation? And I think all of the genes that exist today, originally, they all come about because of a mutation. And so the mutated genes, that might make a lizard camouflage versus not camouflage, those lizards survived, the other ones got picked off. So obviously that gene pool survived. So that's how all genes originally, right? They originally mutated. That's what genes do. And the ones that are functional survive, and the ones that aren't are gone. So, I mean, but that happens over a very, very, very long period of time. That's not something that happens, in a few thousand years.
Well, I'm just thinking, it's like wherever humanity came from, whatever, it's like for it to survive and to make 8 billion, that had to be part of the initial programming. But maybe it was left to chance. And if it didn't happen, if it didn't mutate,
I think
we
those
wouldn't have made it.
Yeah, well, there are some tribes that did go extinct. And, who's to say? Maybe they were very, passive, nonviolent. I mean, assuming this is like a form of, it can take the form of violence, like going to war. And very, passive, agreeable tribes didn't make it. They got taken over. So, there's a possibility that you need a little bit of it, right, in order to protect yourself, protect your tribe.
Right.
So.
And now it's just kind of morphed into entertainment.
It's morphed into entertainment.
Okay, how about why do we like watching it?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's.
Are we waiting for a crash?
Well, not everybody enjoys watching a crash, but it's like there is a certain fascination. Maybe it's just like a sense of amazement, wonder. How can they do that? Like, why do we watch gymnastics at the Olympics? It's one of the favorite sports, because it's just so unbelievable that they can do what they can do, and it's fascinating to watch that a person has achieved that level of training and skill to where they can do things that the rest of us wouldn't ever hope or dream to do. And again, if you don't have the biology to do it, you're probably not going to do it. I mean, I would imagine that someone who has a very, very high level of sensitivity. I mean, I don't know if they've ever done studies on it, but I would imagine you wouldn't find them being race car drivers or top-level gymnasts. Because you have to have a certain amount of not feeling it that acutely, right?
What does that mean?
Well, not being as sensitive to the environment around you, like we talked about, that basic biology that's, that is more stimulation-seeking biology, inside of you
Okay.
to want to do it.
What about women who marry race car drivers?
Well, again, you get back to the the social capital. Why do they marry famous actors, and why are they attracted to any kind of we're all attracted to people who seem very confident and seem very accomplished. That's something that attracts us, and so it would make sense that
Right.
it would be in that category, which might be another motivation, right?
Well, what about, I mean, like we said, it's much safer now. You're probably not going to die. But maybe 30 years ago, when the chances of dying were higher, would a woman even care about that? I mean, I guess if they worried about it too much, they couldn't be.
No, well, I
possibly.
think about all the wives of, like I work with a lot of wives of military, the people who are deployed. And they have to live with the possibility that their husbands are not going to come home all the time. And so that takes a certain amount of resiliency to be able to not perseverate on that thought, because otherwise you would just feel afraid all the time. It's not fun to lose people that we care about, and it can be debilitating if you thought about it too much, right? And we're going over and over that possibility. So in a certain kind of way, you'd have to be able to tell yourself, I mean, think about all the women who are married to people who climb Mount Everest, or do these really, again, risky, cutting edge kinds of things, or extreme sports, or anything. You have to have a way of thinking about it where it doesn't feel like it's under control. They've got all the details worked out. It's safe. You have to tell yourself it's safe, or else who would do it? You wouldn't do it. And more than likely, most of the time, it is safe. It's just you just don't know when that random time is going to show up.
Right, that random time, because life is random.
Life is random, and you always hear about the instructor parasailing or whatever that's called, where you jump off the cliff, and there's a random variable that just comes up out of nowhere. You can't predict everything. You can't foresee every possibility, and so you are still taking that risk. But I imagine that's not something, again, you would think about. You just put it out of your mind, the possibility. Or else, like your driver said, if you want to live, you probably aren't going to be as good. So you can't be thinking about that and holding back. They want to just be free to just go all out. So.
Right.
Yeah, that takes a certain amount of, mental strength to be able to do that. Not everyone can.
Right.
But I mean, it's something you could probably practice and you can get better at. But again, without, and they probably do, if they start from the time they're young and they're exposed to it and they're in a community of people that do it, it just feels it's normalized. It feels like it's all under control, right?
Mental strength. I mean, I've never heard that. Is that just your constitution, your dedication? Is that what you mean?
Well, the way we think about things changes the way we feel. So having some practice in thinking about things in a certain kind of way. And I'm sure race car drivers, if you were to interview them in sort of detail about how they think about things, I bet there's a lot of similarity in terms of how they think about it. You know, they probably think about the fact that they know the technicalities, they know the shape of the car, the technology, the safety features, they know their competitors, they know they've done it enough to where they kind of know how their competitors are going to drive if they're driving against other people. And so it feels like very in control, like I've got this all figured out. And just, you would probably focus on that, I imagine. That's, if I were a race car driver, that's what I would do. So that would take a certain amount of practice. If you went off course, no pun intended, and went and started thinking about all the things that could go wrong, again, you're not going to be able to do what you need to do. And so the same with a gymnast, right? They have to, you know, and when they fall, that there's a certain amount of mental toughness that where you have to get back on and then not let that thought that you fell come in, right? And that takes a certain amount of practice to not let it come in, because it's easy to start perseverating on that, like, oh, you fell, your score's not going to be as high, now you're under more pressure. You know, like you can start telling yourself all these things, and that's going to make it worse. So what you say to yourself makes a big difference. And we all, again, learn those internal dialogues and how to think about things. We learn it from our community. And they're, again, they probably grew up in a community where their dad raced, or, you know, and they're accustomed to thinking about things in a certain kind of way. And they've practiced it over and over and over. So they're, you know, if you looked at their neural network in their brain, it would be different than someone else's. Well, we all have different neural networks, right? Based on what we practice. Someone who plays a guitar, their neural network looks different than a race car driver because they practice different things. But you have to, whatever it is you practice, it's going to help you to either do what it is you're doing or not be able to do it. And so that's why they have coaches sometimes, sports psychologists, that help them think about things in a certain kind of way. That helps you to do your best, to relax. You know, like someone coming up to bat. How you think about when you come up to bat in baseball is going to have a huge effect. Even though you might not think it is, it's, you know, our thoughts are we're either going to tense up, you know, because we're a little nervous, we're not our most relaxed self. So every thought we have is either going to let us relax or tense up. You know, so, you know, there's that inverted curve that says stimulation actually increases performance to a point, and then it inverts and goes down.
Because it
it's too much stimulation. So you have to keep yourself in this sweet spot of like where you're stimulated and you're focused and you're performing at your peak without declining, without going over the hump, because now there's too much stimulation.
What would that look like? What would too much stimulation look like?
Well, when you start to tense up, because you start thinking those thoughts like, oh, I've got 2 strikes now. Now I've got my team's going to be let down, and you know, I won't be able to be in the lineup next week. And you know, you start to think about those things. If they start to enter your thought process,
right.
Your physical body, unbeknownst to you, just in very, very subtle ways, even the, you know, small muscles in your hands start to tense up. Not that you're gripping the bat, but just very, very small, minute kinds of reactions happen. And it's probably the same for a race car driver. You might grip the steering wheel a little tighter, you know, or there's just small things that are either conducive or not conducive. And like in baseball, it makes a big difference where the ball goes, you know, how your swing is, how fluid you are. So ideally, you want to be at the top of that curve, you know, where you still feel relaxed, you feel excited, stimulated, but not
Right.
not starting to think about thoughts that tense you up.
Right. And if you've reached that peak of stimulation and you have to back off, then you have to do some mental work.
That's right. That's right. And that's where the sports psychologists come in, and they try to help. Try to help whatever sport it is, gymnastics, baseball.
Can you say that? When you reach the peak, you need some help.
When you reach the peak, a lot of athletes have to learn how to bring themselves back down. Their breathing, their thoughts, there's ways of bringing your physiology back down to homeostasis, or probably not homeostasis, but just that level of stimulation where it's peak. You don't want to go too far. And so even recognizing within yourself when you've gone too far and that you've got to bring yourself back in the middle of a game, that's something that you really have to practice, right? Or in the middle of a race that you're doing, to notice your body and notice when you're, I see the signs in myself. I know that I've gone over, and I need to breathe. I need to, whatever the things I've practiced to bring my physiology back down.
That's a great concept, because when I was at the Grand Prix, all the in the pits, every race car, has 20 people running around, and there's like banks and banks of computer screens giving feedback on the car. So I'm assuming the driver has to do feedback on himself. Right?
Yeah.
I don't think. They might have diodes on their head.
Well, and they could also have, now we have technology that can tell us, we can tell us when our heart rate is too high, and we could just know that our physiology is going into arousal levels that are so high that it's going to be detrimental. So I need to bring it back down. And that's something you can practice pretty easily, like I said, especially with all the, gadgets that we have now that can help us to get biofeedback, feedback on ourselves. So we just practice, we learn, and then pretty soon you don't need the watch anymore, you don't need the monitor. You just know, because you can feel, internally, you're,
If you're not relaxed.
Yeah, you just know. You know what all the signs are. It's different, slightly different for everybody, where you might feel it, the first signs of when you feel it, and then you know what to do. And that gives you confidence too, that you can stay in that sweet spot.
To be able to adjust during a race.
That's
mentally.
Yeah. Well, that's sometimes the difference between, they're all, when you get to that level of athleticism, they're all really good, right? Tennis, doesn't matter what you're talking about. Golf especially. Boy, golf is the big one, because those tiny, how they always get to the very last hole and they just got to make a putt. It's only 4 feet, and it's that small, tiny muscles that you can't consciously control. So you think you're doing everything right, but the small muscles in your hands are tensing up just enough to where.
But that's a mental, not a flaw, but
it's a normal to pressure.
Right.
Pressure, overstimulation, you're hyper aroused, dysregulated slightly, and you need to bring it back down.
Right.
And so those that can do that while they're in the process, those are the ones that get to those high levels, right? Because they learn how to regulate that. And then of course there's the situation where when you've done it so much, you're Jack Nicklaus or whatever, or Tiger Woods, you've done it so many times that their arousal levels, are a little bit lower, because it's like they've been there and done that. And so it's not going to give you that same overstimulation that someone who's maybe this is their first time, and they're ahead and they just need to make this last putt and they're going to win, so.
Right.
Yeah.
Winning gives you confidence to do it again.
That's right. So that plays into it as well.
Yeah, I need to ask if these drivers have how many physical sensors. Because like I said, there must have been 10, who knows, maybe even more, huge computer screens with everything
about the car.
I wonder if there's a medical screen too. There would have to be.
Well, I don't know I'm not I'm not in the business of, yeah, but I think it would make sense to me that you would.
Got millions of dollars, why not?
Why would you be just monitoring the car and not the driver? I mean,
Right.
the driver's going to be the difference, right?
Your heartbeat's a little up.
Right.
Can you calm it down?
Right. And but not everybody takes advantage of those techniques.
And I'm assuming brain waves too, right?
Well, that's all part of it, yeah. Because that where you are in that arousal response is going to change everything.
Right.
But I think the biggest thing it changes in sports is the sort of the subconscious. You're not aware of how it's tensing your muscles, and that makes a big difference in your flow, in being able to really, they call that state of flow, where you're just relaxed and you're able to do your best, whether you're in gymnastics or shooting the basketball. And that's another one where it's just like really small differences make it or break it. And when you're relaxed, you can sit at the free throw line forever, right, and just keep dunking it, and then all of a sudden you get in a game and you can't do it. So that's what that is. So again, recognizing it in yourself, but again, not all. I don't know if all the athletes really take advantage of. We know a lot about that now, and we can monitor it, and we can learn how to do it, and I think it makes a big difference in your performance at the end of the day. To get into flow state and to be performing at your highest level. That's what the goal, I think, would be.
Right.
Yeah.
But you can't control that. Nature finds the hidden flaw. So if there's something wrong with the race car, it's gonna break, and there's nothing you can do about that.
No. Yeah. No.
You're talking about getting I've always thought if you lived your life by cliches, you'd save a lot of time. And get back on the horse is like one of those cliches. Like if you fail, just keep doing it.
Right. But learn from the failure.
Right.
Take it as information. And, that's, for instance, that's another big thought difference. People who achieve those kinds of levels, Angela Duckworth has done a lot of that research, and then also there's a psychologist at Stanford who wrote Mindset, Carol Dweck, who interviewed people who excelled in all the different, athletics, music, all the different, industries, and how they think about failure and mistakes ended up being a very determining factor. So the people who thought of mistakes as simply information that I need to get better next time are the ones that kept challenging themselves and excelling in their field, and the ones who saw the mistakes as a reflection of their talent or ability tended to shy away from really challenging themselves in those kinds of ways, because they didn't want to feel like there's something wrong with me, or I'm not as smart as I thought I was, or...
Well, would that come from their upbringing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's just a mindset. It's a way of thinking about it. So they're just the thoughts. So maybe if you grew up in a very competitive situation where you were told you were, and this happens quite often, and of course she did all of her research, Carol Dweck, at Stanford students, which obviously they've excelled to get to Stanford in the first place. But she found this difference between them where some of them were always told that you're just smart. You are. So they had an identity of being smart, and they were always the smartest one in the classroom. That's why they ended up at Stanford. But when she would put them in these different experiments, they shied away from doing anything that might, if they didn't feel like they could do it, they would give up. They would give up. So
I'm sorry. Say
yeah.
it again. I'll shut up.
Yeah. So when they were, sometimes she would give them a task where there wasn't even an answer to it, like you couldn't figure it out, and then she'd look at the differences in the two groups, and the group that identified as being I'm smart, they tended to quit sooner. They didn't give it that extra effort because they didn't want to challenge their identity of being smart, right? So if I just don't give it as much time, I can say, well, if I'd given it more time, I might have, might have figured it out. So sometimes Wally Joyner had a great story that he told, where he talked about how there was a pitcher that he was on the team with that had a great slider. Like, he had the best slider that he'd ever seen. And if he threw a slider, it just always worked, right? And he would watch this pitcher, and he'd get into situations where he was, stuck, and he needed that pitch. He needed to get that out. And he would not throw a slider. And Wally said, "But why didn't you throw the slider? What stopped you?" And he said, "Well, if I threw my slider and then I lost, there'd be nothing left." Right? So I have no reason, I have nothing that I can say about, my talent. But if I don't throw my slider, I can say, well, if I'd thrown my slider, I'm sure it would have been able to get the out. So sometimes if it means that much to our identity, we're not gonna go that extra step. The other ones, it didn't mean anything about their identity or ability. They just knew that if they just kept trying, that they would, and getting that negative feedback or that failure over and over, they knew they were going to figure it out eventually. So it didn't mean anything about them. There was no identity involved. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of what society's doing lately, is putting everything on your identity.
Well, we do that as human beings. We grab onto identities and they become who we are, right? And then they become something you have to protect. So, being able to be free enough to where you can say, I'm going to do this and I might fail, and that's okay because it's just information. It doesn't mean anything more than that. That's very freeing, if you think about it.
Failure is information.
Failure is information.
Failure's the best teacher, right?
Huh? Yeah, right? And the more times you fail, the more you know.
Going back to the students and how they grew up, there's a philosophy on good-looking quarterbacks.
Uh-huh.
5 quarterbacks in high school, all with the same ability, but one is just gorgeous. He gets the attention because, good-looking people gravitate to them.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the NFL, they're all gorgeous.
Well, yeah, there's been a lot of research about that too, and that, being attractive opens doors. And, again, it's social capital, right? People they attribute a lot of positive attributes to people based on how they look. It's not fair, but it's just the way, that's what our society does.
All these drivers are gorgeous. They're all good looking.
No doubt.
Right.
And, and if you were going to be a promoter, would you want the guy that's, getting all the attention? Of course you would, right? You're going to sell more tickets.
Yeah, we were watching a documentary. Basically, it's about how India is just basically a death trap. And they got to Mario Andretti, and he didn't win that much, but we're trying to figure out, why is he so famous? He's got the name, Mario Andretti.
Yeah.
He's gorgeous. It from Italy, sounds like Ferrari. So it's all a combination of things. Yeah, society's funny.
Yeah, yeah.
But it must work because there's 8 billion of us, right? So it's all part of the.
Well, it's like what are the books that were written about talent is overrated? Things. There was another one, and they talk about that. Oftentimes, it's the amount of experience and practice that you get, and with some of these sports, like how many times can you get in a race car? Like how many times are you allowed to do that? To get the practice that you need, how many times do you get at bats when you're playing baseball? It's hard to get at bats with a real pitcher, right? You can use a pitching machine, but it's not the same. And so getting that practice oftentimes, based on these other factors that let some people in and maybe don't let others have the same amount of, makes it harder. And that's true for, anything. I think that they said, wasn't it Bill Gates when he talked about how he lived near the first big computer facility, and he used to sneak out at night, and he would go in there and he would program before anybody had access to computers to learn how to program. And he just got really good at it. You have to check my facts on that, but I'm not sure I'm right. But I think it was him that did that. And so he had access, and he practiced for a lot of hours, and just was ahead of the curve because he had all that. So that's another big factor, I think.
Right.
Just being able to get access sometimes to these. Other sports, if it's tennis, you can go get a tennis court anywhere, But a race car driver, race cars, you can't, those aren't, right? I'm sure that the airplanes, how are you going to get access to a plane to fly and, log the hours required to get to that level of expertise, So there's that, too.
Right, the big mechanical things you can't do on your own.
Can't do on your own, and you need to have a pass to get in. And how do you get that pass? And so that's...
Well, with Roberto, he drove race car or go-karts, and he wanted to be an F1 driver, Formula One.
Yeah.
He grew up in Colombia. He didn't tell his parents that. He goes, Dad, there's this great business school in England, in London. Would you send me that for college? Never mentioned racing to his dad. Went to England, went to school, and enrolled in this F1 school without telling anybody. Won a bunch of races, called his dad and said, hey, I had some free time. And he started winning, and his dad was so excited that he got the Colombian government to sponsor him because Colombia never had a
race car
Formula
driver.
One driver.
Yeah. See, that's a perfect example. But he sort of created that opportunity, to himself.
Dad
Right,
was really,
right.
really wanted to do.
Right.
Because he had that. Yeah, I can understand now. He got the rush from driving.
Right.
Nothing else was exciting. Maybe life was pretty boring. There you go. It's all kind of making sense.
Yeah. Again, that biology mixed with your experiences, and it creates motivation, desire to go do it again and again and again. So, and how people respond to you. Maybe all his classmates thought he was something else because he could, do a go-kart. He was the best go-kart driver. So, yeah.
And I can understand now why, when he came out of the coma, when he described it, I just woke up and I got back to racing.
Right.
Of course I'd wake up.
Right.
Because this is who I am.
Yeah.
I don't care how. He had no clue this whole backstory.
Right.
Why would he care?
Yeah.
He woke up, and
He wanted to get right back to
a
it.
little bit of therapy, and just back in the car.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's a lot of things drive people to want to do the impossible, really. Recovering from some of those accidents, I'm sure it's amazing what they do sometimes. And that's how driven they are, no pun intended, but, internally they're motivated because it's something that has been so much a part of them. They can't imagine living life not doing it, right? And so they're going to do whatever it takes to get back to whatever it is. Yeah. So it's remarkable.
And I wonder if as you get older, your mortality starts to seep in, right?
Yeah, well...
Maybe your skills just deteriorate, right? And you know that, and it's time to quit.
Yeah, and that brings up a whole different question, when you get back to identity, who are you really, You maybe raced cars your whole life, and that's something you enjoyed doing. It's part of your experience. But as you age, you can't, those things that brought a lot of, gave you a lot of social capital, you can't do them anymore. And so then what happens? Who are you then? And developing and being able to pivot and sort of get to know yourself on a whole different level, and create new ways of being in the world. It's a challenge. It's no small thing, and people go through it even when they just retire from their profession, and they might not have even really liked the profession they had, but they still, that's how they identified themselves, and that's who I am. I'm this person who goes to work, and I'm doing whatever it is I'm doing, and then all of a sudden you don't do that one day, and if you don't prepare for it, it can hit you pretty hard. So.
Yeah, people die, right?
They used to.
They have a heart attack.
Yeah. It used to be a trend. Of course, these days people are working until they die. So maybe that's not so much a problem anymore, but it's
Okay.
Fascinating. Yeah?
Fantastic.
Yeah? Got what you wanted?
Oh, you bet.
Okay, good.
I'd love to have you on camera, but.